All right, so we're going through chapter 16. I'm going to start that today. I had sent out a rather long outline, which it won't take as long as it looks because a lot of it is just reading what's on the outline. So it's not going to really take as long as whatever it is, 11 pages. It'll take much less than that. What I'd like to do is start by just reading the passage, so all of chapter 16, and then I'm going to talk about the interpretations of some preterists, not all preterists, but of some preterists, and I'm going to give their interpretations so that you can see what they say about the passage. And then I'm going to do a bit of a critique of that and ask some questions about that type of approach to interpreting the scripture. So let me get someone to read. Shirley, can you read maybe the first 11 verses, and then Mom, can you read the rest of the chapter from that 12 through the end? Go ahead, Shirley.
Okay. The first vow. And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying it to the seven angels, go your way and pour out the vows of the wrath of God upon the earth. And the first angel went and poured out his vow upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. The second vow. And the second angel poured out his vow upon the sea. It became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea. The third vow. And the third angel poured out his vow upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angels of the waters say, you are righteous, O Lord, which are and was and shall be, because you have judged us. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another out of the altar say, even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments. The fourth vow. And the fourth angel poured out his vow upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which has power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. The fifth vow. And the fifth angel poured out his vow upon the sea of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains of their swords, and repented not of their deeds.
The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up, to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Then I saw three evil spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are spirits of demons, performing miraculous signs. And they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. Behold, I come like a thief. Blessed is he who stays awake and keeps his clothes with him, so that he may not go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, it is done. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since man has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. The great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky, huge hailstones of about 100 pounds each fell upon men, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible.
Thank you to the readers. So the seven bowls or vials of God's wrath, and this is the prophetic, poetic description of them. And what I'd like to do is go to the outline now and just kind of look at the interpretations of some preterist groups. By no means not all preterists. I think this is a minority view, but I wanted to show you these interpretations so that you can think about them, and then I'm going to, as I said, critique it at the end. So starting on maybe a little bit less than halfway down on the first page, I'm just giving select interpretations of select bowls, so I'm not going through all of them. But in the second bowl, which was the sea turned to blood, some preterists see the fulfillment of that in the bloodying of the waters during the war leading to the fall of Jerusalem. And they quote Josephus. Josephus is a big source for, historically what happened, and it's used a lot. He's used a lot in preterist interpretation. So Josephus, after describing a battle that took place on the Mediterranean Sea, wrote, quote, "The sea was bloody a long way, and the maritime ports were full of dead bodies." And then a little bit in another place, referring to the same time period in the same war, Josephus, referring to the killing of many Jews by the Sea of Galilee, wrote, quote, "One might then see the lake all bloody and full of dead bodies, for not one of them escaped." So you can see how this might be used as a fulfillment of the sea turning to blood. You can see that we have almost what's a literal fulfillment here that the preterists would look at. The third bowl, fresh water turned to blood, Josephus wrote again, quote, "The Jordan could not be passed over by reason of the dead bodies that were in it, but because the lake Asphaltitis, the Dead Sea, was also full of bodies that were carried down into it by the river." So he doesn't mention blood there, but you can get the idea of full of dead bodies. This is a really horrific thing to picture. And you can see how the preterists would say, or could say, someone could say, these are fulfillments of the sea and the fresh water turning to blood. So we have this carnage from the war. The sixth bowl was the kings of the East. And many preterists suggest that the kings of the East are the provincial rulers in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, who historically brought their armies across the Euphrates and combined with the main Roman forces to make war on the Jews in the siege of Jerusalem. And historically, where they actually combined with the main forces of the Roman army is in the plains of Megiddo, which is often thought to be Armageddon. And so that would tie it there too. And so we have provincial rulers in the East. The Roman Empire was made up of a lot of different people groups, and there were provincial, local rulers, and they had their own forms of government that were underneath the Roman Empire, but not particularly Roman government in all places. And so this is what some preterists think's going on, is that there's these groups from across the Euphrates in the eastern part of the empire, the kings of the East, that cross the Euphrates, gather at Armageddon, and then go on to fight in the battle against Jerusalem. The seventh bowl has, as was read, thunder, lightning, and an earthquake, natural phenomenon. And some preterists note that there was a violent thunderstorm along with an earthquake just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, again from Josephus. For there broke out a prodigious storm in the night, with the utmost violence and very strong winds, with the largest showers of rain, with continual lightnings, terrible thunderings, and amazing concussions and bellowings of the earth. That was in an earthquake. These things were a manifest indication that some destruction was coming upon men when the system of the world was put into this disorder, and anyone would guess that these wonders foreshadowed some grand calamities that were coming. Josephus wrote this. And then one other illustration, or two other illustrations, the second to the last one, the great city splits into three parts in the seventh bowl. Preterists explain this as referring to the three warring factions in the city. Summarized from Josephus, shortly after the thunderstorm mentioned above, a three-way civil war erupted in the city, in Jerusalem, which by now was under siege, and so it was everybody was locked in. The Jewish rebels were split into three factions led by John, Simon, and Eleazar, respectively. Eleazar and his men were stationed in the inner court of the temple. Simon, the son of Garias, controlled the upper city and much of the lower, and John controlled the rest of Jerusalem. Each fought against the others to control the city. And this is mentioned not only by preterists, but by many interpreters, even amillennialists who are idealists, mention a lot of the things that I've pointed out here, but particularly the city splitting into three parts is usually tied with these rebel groups bringing this divisiveness and fighting against each other. Part of the reason that that Jerusalem didn't just fall because the Romans, and Jerusalem also fell because of this internal fighting. So that's interesting. And then this last one, hailstones and curses, the great hailstones the size of about 75 to 100 pounds fell on the city according to Revelation 16. And men cursed God because of the plague of the hail, because it was so severe. And the explanation given by preterists is that the stones are from Roman catapults, and the men cursed God by mocking him in relation to the great stones. And it's again from Josephus. Now the stones that were cast were of a weight of a talent. That's how they're described in Revelation 16, or how the hailstones are described also. Weight of a talent, 75 to 100 pounds, and were carried 2 furlongs and farther. The blow they gave was no way to be sustained, not only by those that stood first in the way, but by those that were beyond them for a great space. As for the Jews, they at first watched the coming of the stone, for it was a white color, and could therefore not only be perceived by the great noise it made, but could be seen also before it came by its brightness. Accordingly, the watchmen that sat upon the towers gave them notice when the engine was let go and the stone came from it, and cried out loud in their own country language, "The sun cometh." That's thought to be blasphemy. That last thing there, "the sun cometh." So that's a cursing of God. So preterist interpretation then of the hailstones is that they're these Roman catapult stones. And this particular image, I think, is more convincing than, it has more, maybe not convincing, but it's more persuasive than even the bloody rivers and the bloody sea, which seem to be even more literally fulfilled. This, I've seen people who, I've seen preterist commentators who don't agree with all of the other things that I've just read, but this one they go, well, wow, that seems like that's really what happened. This is a fulfillment of this. These catapults are a fulfillment of those hailstones, and you can, I think, probably see how attractive this type of interpretation is. And I wanted to just make a couple of comments about it because I don't think it's right. You might think it's right, and that's okay. But I'm making my comments about my view. So to summarize the, that table summarizes what we just went through. I don't think that we have to. Well, maybe we should read it. So, visionary content, second seal, visionary content, sea turns to blood, fulfillment, sea appears to have turned to blood, has blood in the water. Third vial, fresh water turns to blood, fresh water appears to have turned to blood. Sixth one, kings of the east crossed the Euphrates and gathered on Armageddon, political rulers, blah, 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 gather at Megiddo. Seventh one, thunder, lightning, earthquake, preterist fulfillment, thunder, lightning, earthquake. Seventh, city splits into 3 parts. 3 warring factions arise in the city. Seventh, hailstones weighing approximately 1 talent. And the fulfillment, white colored catapult stones weighing approximately 1 talent. What we notice about this is that this is a 1-for-1 correspondence. This is very similar to what people mean when they say you should interpret the Bible literally. And so a dispensationalist will come to, who says that, will come to similar understandings. Sea turning to blood means, say John MacArthur, leading classical dispensationalist, he says that the sea turning to blood is the red tide. And do you guys know what the red tide is? So the red tide is, little microbiological organisms that turn a certain color at certain times of year, bioluminescent, and they turn red. MacArthur says that's going to happen all over the world, freshwater and saltwater, and that people actually, that'll be the only water available, so they'll have to drink it. So when it says they drink blood, he'll be drinking the bioluminescent water. So on his literal interpretation, the sea turning to blood is, the sea appears to turn to blood, just like on this one. Yeah, but he's a futurist, and the preterists are not futurist, of course. They're talking about first century Jerusalem. Anyway, all of the interpretations of a literal interpreter are going to look like this. And let's see if this is, what I want to know is that is this the right way to interpret the literature? And so I have a couple of criticisms about this type of interpretation, and now I'm criticizing the preterists. Not all of them, but this group of preterists. I consider myself a preterist interpreter, and I'm pointing the finger at this other group within my camp and saying, no, that's not right, because it treats apocalyptic literature as if it's historical narrative. That's the first point. Apocalyptic literature, if you'll remember, one of the key characteristics, one of the main characteristics of apocalyptic literature is that it's highly figurative. It is mostly symbolic. It is almost thoroughly symbolic. It is poetry at the furthest extreme. And so it's the exact opposite of a historical narrative. In fact, some interpreters, when they're talking about reading prophecy, which is a subgenre of poetry, and apocalyptic, which is even further into the poetic sphere, they say, well, when you're reading historical narrative and when you're reading law, your assumption is that should be of literalness. You should be assuming literal unless something in the context tells you it's figurative. But when you get to a poetic literature, you should be assuming figurative unless something in the context tells you otherwise. And so the presumption then is that this is figurative, apocalyptic literature, and that would mean Revelation 16. So my first criticism of this type of interpretation is that it's taking what is not prose and interpreting it as if it's prose, when actually what it is it's poetry, and poetry that's highly symbolic. And the second criticism is similar. It fails to appreciate that figurative language expresses content by means of symbols. And what that means is that the sea of blood does not mean the sea of blood. A symbol always points to something other than itself. What John sees in his visions are symbols. He does not describe for us anything but symbols, and those things are symbolic of something else. And that's the way we've been pursuing interpretation as we've been going through the Revelation. But when we get to chapter 16, it's very difficult for people to not fall into what I see here happening to this group of preterists and what happens to dispensationalists, because it looks like things I can understand. Oh, the sea turning to blood. I can totally picture that. So it must be sea turning to blood. Oh, hailstones, they look like catapults. And so what happens is we changed our understanding of what John is seeing, right? When you get to chapter 16 and you start doing that, what you end up saying is things like, John is describing things in picturesque language, but they're basically the things that he's seen. And in other parts of the Revelation, a dispensationalist might say something like this, so we're all familiar with Hal Lindsey's interpretation of the locusts out of the pit as helicopters. And what Hal Lindsey would say is that John saw things that he didn't have a vocabulary for. He saw things in our day. He doesn't have a vocabulary for it, so he describes them as these locust creatures, right? And what they're looking for is something that looks like a locust. They're looking at John's description and they're trying to figure out, what does this look like? Oh, that looks kind of like a helicopter. That must be a helicopter. Now, Chuck Smith thought they were genetically altered locusts. I mean, actually, scientific experiment gone wrong that got out of the lab and, is going to infect the entire world with these terrible locusts. And he's a dispensationalist futurist too, so it's not obvious that they're helicopters, but you can see the method that that's being used. And I see this method that the preterists are using here as really similar to that. They're like, oh, red water. What? I can picture that. What made the water red? So I'd like to do an example, a couple of examples from the Old Testament to kind of illustrate the point I'm trying to make. So let's look at 2 Samuel 22. The 2 Samuel 22 is not a prophecy, but it is useful to understanding prophecy, and I'll explain why after we read it. (22) verse 1, and David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. So we're told in the very first verse that what this is a song that David wrote on the day. It's a praise to God, basically, for delivering him from the hands of his enemies and the hands of Saul. So we're going to be expected to see that this is a praise for deliverance. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer. My God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. I call upon the Lord who is trustworthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord, to my God I called. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy, thick clouds, a gathering of water. Out of the brightness before him, coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. And the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. With the merciful you show yourself merciful. With the blameless man you show yourself blameless. With the purified you deal purely, and with the crooked you make yourself seem tortuous. You save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. For you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? This God is my strong refuge, and has made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer, and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war, so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your gentleness made me great. You gave a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies and destroyed them, and did not turn back until they were consumed. I consumed them. I thrust them through so that they did not rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, those who hated me, and I destroyed them. They looked, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as the dust of the earth. I crushed them and stamped them down like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from strife with my people. You kept me as the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. Foreigners came cringing to me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be my God, the rock of my salvation, the God who gave me vengeance and brought down peoples under me, who brought me out from my enemies. You exalted me above those who rose against me. You delivered me from men of violence. For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing praises to your name. Great salvation he brings to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever. Thanks for your patience as I read that long passage. So this is, as David says at the beginning, it is a song of deliverance, and we see that from the very first verse that's quoted, verse 2, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. It talks about its enemies, the Lord's actions on his behalf. David describes his predicament as a person who is drowning and who is taken out of the water. He describes the Lord as throwing thunderbolts and shooting arrows and coal and flaming fire coming out of the Lord's presence and consuming his enemies. When we look at the historical record, which is First and Second Samuel of David and his deliverance from all of the enemies, we don't see any of that. Right? We don't see any of that. We do see in the latter part of the psalm, he talks about his military victories over his enemies, and we do see some of that. But we don't see how he actually describes the Lord's intervention in all of this. What we see is the Lord's favor and protection on David in bringing about his deliverance by giving David strength, or by making his enemies foolish, or by other means. But there's no arrows from heaven, and there's no flood, and there's no water that David has to be rescued from. And there's no earthquake, and there aren't thunder and lightning, not that we're aware of. And I would say that we're aware of what actually happened, because that's what the purpose of the historical record in First and Second Samuel is. The point I want you to think about is that the song of deliverance is poetic, and the historical record is historical narrative. And they're two different genres, and they describe the same thing. They describe the same thing in different ways because they're different genres. Now, suppose all we had was 2 Samuel 22, and we did not have the historical record, and we did not know what happened with David, what the deliverances looked like, what the actual difficulties that David faced were, how the Lord brought about rescuing him. And we didn't know those things. The question is, could you reconstruct those things? Could you reconstruct the historical record based on chapter 22? No, it would be impossible. It would be impossible. I think that's analogous to the situation that we have when we look at predictive prophecy that is in a poetic form. I think it's exactly the same. I don't think it's possible to say this is what this is exactly. You can't construct the historical situation from the poetic description. I'll give you one more example. This one is a prophecy. Let's look at Isaiah 13. (21 verses, 22 verses). Becky, can you read that? Just the chapter 13 of Isaiah.
A prophecy against Babylon that Isaiah son of Amoz saw. Raise a banner on a bare hilltop. Shout to them, beckon to them to enter the gates of the nobles. I have commanded those I prepared for battle. I have summoned my warriors to carry out my wrath, those who rejoice in my triumph. Listen, a noise on the mountain like that of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms like nations massing together. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come destruction from the Almighty. Because of this, all hands will go limp. Every heart will melt with fear. Terror will seize them. Pain and anguish will grip them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at each other, their faces aflame. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened. The moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger. Like sheep without a shepherd, they will all return to their own people. They will flee to their native land. Whoever is captured will be thrust through. Those who are caught will fall by the sword. Their infants will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be looted and their wives violated. See, I will stir up against them the Medes, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men, and they will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. There nomads will pitch their tents. There, nomads will pitch their tents. There, no shepherds will rest their flocks, but desert creatures will lie there. Jackals will fill her houses, where the owls will dwell, and there the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will inhabit her strongholds, jackals her luxurious palaces. Her time is at hand, and her days will not be prolonged.
Thank you, Becky. So this talks about, like it says in the first verse, it's a oracle concerning the coming judgment on Babylon. Verse 17 tells us that this judgment will be affected by the Medes, who God will stir up against them. And if you were to take a guess as to what the conquering of Babylon looked like by the Medes based on this passage, now we're not going to talk about stars falling and things like that, but we'll just talk about a military action against Babylon. Infants will be dashed on rocks. Babies, women will be raped and places will be pillaged, and all these people are going to die. And it's going to be a desolation, and all of the countries that have been conquered by Babylon, all the people will flee out of Babylon and go back to their native countries. Right? That's what we read. So anybody other than me know what happened? Know actually what happened? Okay, so this is fascinating. So you can read about the prelude to it in Daniel 5. Daniel 5 is the vision of Daniel. Well, actually, Belshazzar is at a party. Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, on his last night alive, is having a party. And there's writing on the wall. And the writing, the interpretation of the writing is basically, you've lost the kingdom. It's given to the Medes and Persians, and tonight you're going to die. And he does. And the Babylonians had not thought that would have been possible, because Babylonia was the city itself, where the king is a walled city with walls that are really thick, 18, 20, 30, 40 feet wide. I don't remember exactly how wide, but some really thick, really tall walls, just like Jerusalem had really thick, really tall walls. All ancient cities did. And it was considered to be impossible for an army to get in to the city. And if you can't get into where the king is, you can't actually overthrow the country. So, but Babylon had this other interesting feature. All cities need a water source, and Babylon's water source was the Euphrates River, and the Euphrates River ran right through the city. And it went under the city, and they had wells going down in the city to get their water supply. Cyrus, who was the king of Persia and had made an alliance with Darius, the king of the Medes, and the Medes are mentioned in the passage here, and Cyrus is mentioned in other passages in the Bible. Isaiah 45 is the king who would overthrow Babylon. Anyway, it was a joint effort of Cyrus of Persia and Darius of the Medes. And what Cyrus did was he diverted the Euphrates River so that it went dry. And then the troops walked under the city walls and right up into the capital, and they showed up in Darius's bedroom and killed him. And that was it. That's the extent of the bloodshed. The rule of I said Darius's bedroom. They showed up in Belshazzar's bedroom, and they killed him, just like Daniel had said. And that's the extent of all the bloodshed. The Babylonian rule at that time was so distasteful to the people that they received Cyrus and Darius as saviors. And there was no massive bloodshed. There was no throwing of babies against rocks. There was no raping of women. There were no piles of bodies everywhere. There was no fleeing back to native countries. And Babylon did not become a desolation. In fact, even in New Testament times, there was still an outpost there where people had lived continually. So it wasn't a great city anymore, but it had become, so anyway, nobody in the Old Testament time who had experienced the fall of Babylon would say, oh, Isaiah is a false prophet. None of that happened. Nobody would say that because they didn't understand prophecy in that way. They go, this is a poetic description of what's going to happen. What's going to happen? Babylon's going to be overthrown. That's it. Babylon's going to be overthrown. These are all images that are used in other places to represent the Lord's intervention in history and the removal of one power and the replacing it of another. And it doesn't actually tell you exactly what's going to happen. What happens, after the fact. But what is going to happen, you can't know before it happens. So anyway, the point that I'm making with these illustrations with the 2 Samuel 22, which was a poem after the fact, and this Isaiah 13, which is a prophecy before the fact, is that if all you had was the poetic representation, you wouldn't be able to tell what was going to happen. Gail, I think you were going to say.
Well, in listening to what you just said, it came to me, the poetry. So he defined the diminishment of Babylon, that it would change in government, so to speak, in how it was ruled. But it almost sounds like what he did based on that. He saw the vision of Babylon going away as it was, being reformed, reorganized, redone. And because of the times in which he lived and seen and known of other kingdoms coming down in that way, in the poetry way, in absolute, complete, total, immoral devastation, that he then interpreted what he saw as a vision as this is probably how it came down. Would you say that that might be how he saw it? He saw the vision is coming down, it's being redone, but he didn't see it as a non-violent way other than the king going.
Yeah, I think, everybody, there are a limited number of opinions a person could have on, or answers that a person could have to that question. My answer is that I think, well, I don't know about Isaiah, but I know if this was Amos, what Amos would have thought. Amos would have thought, I got no idea what this is going to look like. I got no idea. I mean, if you turn to Amos, and I think Isaiah probably shared that opinion. So it was at this point that I paused the video because I couldn't find the passage I was looking for. I was looking for passages such as Jeremiah 1:11, where the Lord asked the prophet, "What do you see?" And the prophet gives a response, in this case, an almond branch. And then the Lord gives the interpretation of that thing that Jeremiah sees, that the prophet sees. And of course, the interpretation does not involve an olive branch. This occurs throughout the prophets. Jeremiah 1:13, it happens again. Jeremiah 24:3, Amos 7:8, Amos 8:2, Zechariah 4:2, Zechariah 5:2. You can see that it happens in many different places. And the Lord shows the prophet something. The prophet sees that thing, and then the Lord gives the interpretation, which is not that thing. And so the Lord is speaking to the prophets in symbols. And the prophet then, in answer to Gail's initial question, the prophet would not have been able to know what the Lord was conveying by that symbol unless the Lord tells the prophet. And so the prophet would not say, the prophet would not think or presume to know what the image meant unless the Lord had told him. And that's exactly the same way we interpret the images. We look to see if the Lord has told us in his word what these images mean. So anyway, I paused the recording at that point because I could not remember exactly where any of these passages were, but those are the ones. Just if you go to a concordance and look up in quotes, "What do you see?" you will find those passages. So after I paused the recording, I forgot to turn it back on again. So this is what I said in summary after I came back to the recording. So Gail had asked a question regarding how should we understand these details in the prophecies if they're not fulfilled exactly the same way that the details are given. It's a very good question. And I think it's helpful to think about this question in relationship to the way we understand parables. Now, of course, parables and prophecy are not the same thing, but they're both in a poetic, figurative genre, or a genre that uses figurative pictures to convey meaning. So in a parable, if you think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, that was asked, or that was delivered by Jesus in response to the question, "Who is my neighbor?" And the point of that parable is that everybody who God puts you in contact with is your neighbor, and you should love everybody who God puts you in contact with. That your neighbor is whomever is in your circle of influence or who you come across in your daily affairs. And that's the point of the parable. The point of the parable has nothing to do with 30 pieces of silver or the inn or the donkey or the wine that was used to cleanse the wounds or any of those details. Those details are part of the parable, and the parable is given to give a picture. The story gives a picture of, which is the answer to the question. And the question again was, "Who is my neighbor?" And the story provides us with that answer, but the details in the story are only there to fill the story out so that we can better picture it, so we can better understand it. The details do not have discrete meaning. They don't have meaning apart from their contribution to the story. I think it's helpful, like I said, to think about prophetic writings that are in the poetic genre, like Isaiah 13, or the book of Revelation, the visions in the book of Revelation, to think of those things as conveying the point, a point, and that the details in the visions are meant to fill out the picture. And often these details, as we've seen, refer to previous usage in the Old Testament. And what we're supposed to get from those passages that are being referred to is the point of the passages. And generally, the point of the passages is something along the lines of God will take care of his people. He will avenge the blood of his servants. He will judge the enemy. God will make all things right. God is to be counted on and faithful. He is faithful and he is just and he is holy and he is loving toward his people, and he will bring about everything that he has promised. So the question about what are we being promised in a prophetic text, sometimes well, all the time the answer is we're being promised the big picture. God will take care of his people, etc. Whatever the main point is. Whether we're being promised so we are given these details, and the details sometimes are things that happen, and sometimes they're not. What always happens, though, is the big picture point of the prophecy. And as I had said, and I don't know if this was recorded previously, so I'll just say it now again, regarding Isaiah 13, if it had been fulfilled in exactly the same detail that the prophecy was given in Isaiah 13, nobody would have been surprised. On the other hand, it wasn't fulfilled that way, and nobody was surprised, because the point of the prophecy, the way they understood it, and the way we ought to understand prophecy of this nature, is, like I said, in the general point of the prophecy, the picture being painted gives us the idea that we know what's going to happen, and we know it's going to happen in general truths. God will take care of his people. God will judge the enemy. God will vindicate his name, etc. So I think that's helpful to remember that when we're dealing with prophecy, that we're dealing with something closer to parable than we are to historical narrative. Now, I also mentioned, and I don't think this was before we paused it, I also mentioned that sometimes when we get to Revelation 16, and there's this obvious reliance upon or reuse of images that come out of the Exodus of Egypt, where God sent the plagues and judged the Egyptians. Sometimes it's said, hey, those plagues were fulfilled literally. God said there would be darkness, and there was darkness. God said there would be frogs, and there were frogs. God said the water would turn to blood, and it did. And since those plagues were literal, fulfilled literally, we should expect these same ones in Revelation 16 to be fulfilled in a literal manner. Now, just think about it for a second. Think about what is the genre in Exodus and what is the genre in Revelation 16? Are they the same? The genre in Exodus is historical narrative, and the genre in Revelation 16, as we know, is apocalyptic vision. They're not the same. And so that would lead us to not expect them to be fulfilled exactly the same way. If they were, that would not be something we'd be surprised about, but if they're not, we'd not be surprised about it, because we're dealing with an apocalyptic genre. So that is, those are basically the comments that I made after I paused the video. So I hope this has been helpful to you, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks. Bye-bye.